She was 8 years old when her parents gave her away, not to a school, not to a family, to a stone cell attached to a monastery where a woman named Jutta lived, sealed away from the world. They called it a holy life. They called it God's will. But here's what it really was: a tomb for living girls. Hildegard had been seeing visions since she was 3. Flashes of emerald light, symbols no one else could see, a knowing that came from somewhere beyond. Her parents were terrified, the village whispered. So they did what noble families did in 1098 with daughters who saw things they couldn't explain. They gave her to the church. Jutta's cell was barely bigger than a closet. Cold stone, dim light, and Jutta herself, a woman who believed suffering brought you closer to God. She fasted until her body was skeletal. She wore a spiked chain under her clothes that tore into her skin. She prayed barefoot in winter until her feet bled. This was the woman chosen to teach little Hildegard how to be holy. For 30 years, Hildegard lived in that tiny space, learning to read Latin, to sing psalms, to stay quiet about the visions that never stopped coming. Because she understood something crucial. If she told the truth about what she was seeing, about the emerald energy flowing through all living things, about the divine feminine power speaking directly to her, they would call her possessed. And possessed girls don't survive. When Jutta finally died in 1136, half destroyed by her own rituals, the nuns looked at Hildegard and they made her their leader. Hildegard was 38 years old. She had spent 3 decades in silence. Now she was done being silent. She started writing down her visions, not as confessions, as theology, as direct messages from God. She wrote about Viriditas, the greening power, the life force that flows through nature, through women, through everything the male priesthood tried to control. She documented hundreds of medicinal plants, the healing properties of crystals like emeralds and sapphires, how to cure the body using what the earth provided. She composed music unlike anything the church had ever heard, soaring, otherworldly melodies that people claimed could heal sickness. And then she did something almost unthinkable for a woman in the 12th century. She wrote to the Pope. And she told him the church was corrupt. She wrote to bishops and told them they were wrong. She challenged the most powerful men in Europe, and she did it in writing with her name on it. When her community outgrew the original monastery, she demanded her own space. She founded an entirely new monastery at Rupertsberg against fierce opposition from the monks who didn't want to lose control, and she won. At 60 years old, she went on preaching tours, standing in front of crowds in cities across Germany, speaking publicly about God, about corruption, about reform. Women didn't do that. Women weren't allowed. But no one could stop her, because Hildegard had figured out the key. She framed everything as divine revelation. Every challenge to male authority was repackaged as obedience to God's direct command. She claimed no personal power. She said she was just a vessel, an uneducated woman transmitting messages from the living light. And it worked. The same church that would burn other women for herbalism, for claiming visions, for teaching without permission, they couldn't touch Hildegard. She had the protection of noble birth, the approval of a papal commission that verified her visions were authentic, the intelligence to speak their language while destroying their authority. But here's what makes her story so powerful. Everything Hildegard did, herbalism, crystal healing, channeling divine messages, writing about women's bodies and sexuality, believing in sacred feminine energy, these were the exact same practices that got other women killed. The difference wasn't what she did, it was who she was and how she framed it. Thousands of other women across Europe were doing the same things, healing with plants, seeing visions, understanding energy, trusting their intuition. But they were peasants. They were beguines living outside monastery walls. They didn't have noble protection or church approval. And they burned. Marguerite Porete, a mystic who wrote about the soul's direct connection to God, was burned at the stake in 1310, just 130 years after Hildegard died. Her crime? Teaching the same things Hildegard taught, but without the protection. The line between saint and heretic, between mystic and witch, was never about the truth of what these women knew. It was about power, about who got to decide what counted as holy. Hildegard understood this, and she played the game perfectly. She spent her last years writing, healing, composing, teaching. She outlived every man who tried to diminish her. When she died at 81, she left behind a massive body of work, books on theology, medicine, music, natural science. Proof that everything they said women couldn't do, she had done. It took the church 833 years to officially canonize her. They made her a saint in 2012, a doctor of the church, one of only 4 women ever given the title. But here's what they'll never say out loud. Hildegard wasn't powerful because she was obedient. She was powerful because she understood exactly how to be disobedient and survive. She proved that spiritual authority doesn't come from priests. It comes from direct connection to the divine. She showed that healing doesn't require their permission, that women's bodies hold sacred power, that the feminine divine is real. The same truths that got other women tortured and killed. She just knew how to say it in a way they couldn't burn her for. So when someone tells you that your intuition isn't real, that your healing practices are superstition, that women can't have direct access to spiritual power, remember Hildegard of Bingen. Remember the 8-year-old girl they locked in a cell to silence. And remember that she became more powerful than any of them. Not by breaking the rules openly, but by rewriting them from the inside. The witch they couldn't burn, because she convinced them she was a saint.